everything recording. I'll make sure that last week's video is posted. I thought I did it, but now I'm not sure. I have some videos to post today during our lab period, I'm sure. Okay. So let's go back, actually. I wanted to cover real quick a little bit about deception, okay? So we didn't quite get that, but I wanted to clarify a few things about how deception works because we're going to work on reciprocal altruism too, and then mostly population biology today. All right, so we talked about altruism and reciprocal, and we talked about not just altruism, but specifically Hamilton's rule in protecting your relatives. And one of the reasons why this is surprising is because animals often, we think of sneakiness actually as a reasonably good adaptation. A lot of organisms have deception adaptations. Hognose snakes, for instance, play dead when perturbed by a predator. This is, again, a behavior. If the predator runs over to it, it'll flip on its back and pretend to be dead. Now, hognose snakes are not that smart. If you take them and you flip them back onto their belly, they're going to flip over again. So they're not actually very good at playing dead. But it does trick the predators they need to trick. Now, male and female fireflies flash species-specific signals. So what that means is that the males will flash, I'm a male, I'm a male, I'm a male, I'm a male of this species. And female fireflies will flash, I'm a female of this species, and it's sort of how they find each other because they don't make noise. Now, taking advantage of that communication, a certain type of firefly, particularly the females who need more protein to create eggs, they attract a male of a different species. They basically flash their light, but in a pattern that's not going to attract a male of their own species. Instead, they're attracting a smaller male of a different species who thinks he's coming to woo a lady of his species, and then instead, she eats him. So not the kindest, right? These predatory fireflies are quite violent. But it's sort of like if, most of us are females in here. I think actually this is an all-female class right now. And you know that texting with someone and meeting up with them, well, you should meet in a public place, because what if that male wishes to hurt you? Or we always have that serial killer fear. Well, this is a valid fear for fireflies too, except usually the females are eating the males. Interestingly, another way to survive is that plants will practice sexual deception. Okay, this is a orchid. Looks kind of like a female in the mating position. These are males. They have been tricked by the orchid. It also puts off a scent very similar to a female wasp. The male's been tricked into having sex with the plant. And, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't press to share slides. Well, I have completely confused everyone. All right, let's go back. I thought I was sharing. Okay, my fault. I could see them myself, so I wasn't realizing. Apologies. Here you go. Here's the hognose snake. Here's the firefly I was talking about. I thought I pressed share. I think I just pressed record, so thanks for letting me know, Angela. Okay, here you go. Here are the very confused males. Again, this is the female firefly. This is the hognose snake. Okay. So you can see that this looks like it doesn't look that much like a wasp, but wasps are not so smart. Plus, if it smells like a wasp and it's shaped like a wasp, well, they think it's a female wasp. This additionally is a bee. And the bees, well, another bee will land on it, smell it, feel it, looks and feels like a female bee, and they will have sex with it. And then they'll go have sex with another one, and, well, they've pollinated, haven't they? So it's sort of a weird thing. The plants are basically they're literally using their, the bugs for sex, but like for their own sex, but it's a very confusing thing. They're transferring the sperm of the plant. This can happen sometimes. So we saw of interspecies deception. That happens a lot. It can even happen in the same species. Male bluegills will mimic a female. Okay, so here's this territorial male. Okay, they grow larger. Some males, instead of growing larger and looking like a male, they will instead, especially if there's many territorial males around, change their behavior and their color and become a mimic male. These are all the same species. This is the female. This is the male pretending to be a female. The territorial male thinks he's courting two females. And when it becomes breeding season, the female will lay her eggs, and the territorial male will go to put his sperm on them. That's how fish have sex, basically. But the mimic instead will release his sperm on it, and as well, and then he'll run away. This is a very sneaky thing to do, and again, it's done to other members of his own species. And oftentimes this kind of deception is beneficial evolutionarily. This female mimic male is able to father offspring, but doesn't help care for them. So that's not really cool. Literally, this is a catfish. A literal catfish, in the sense that he is tricking someone, sort of like someone would online, tricking someone into thinking, oh, they're a female, oh, they're being nice to me, I should send them money, sort of thing. It's a very similar concept here, except this female mimic male is tricking them until he's able to fertilize the eggs as well. We'll cover toxic defenses later because I do need to get through other pieces, but something to note is that deception is only going to work when it's relatively rare. If deceit becomes common, natural selection favors individuals that can detect and avoid or punish liars. In the sense that if all the snakes start to pretend that they're dead, eventually some hawk or other predator is going to catch on. It's going to be like, wait a second, I'm pretty sure that snake is not dead. And we'll try to bite it, realize it's alive, and then start eating the snakes, okay? So, and that will be beneficial to that individual, and they'll pass on that ability, either by teaching or by, through genetics, to detect the liar. Similarly, these mimics here will, this male, if it can detect who's pretending to be female, then they're going to have a higher fitness. But if liars are rare, natural selection favors individuals that are sometimes fooled, but rewarded usually for honest responses. If this only happens occasionally, then not tasting a dead thing is good for the bird. If this only happens occasionally, then not, then courting two females is good. So you shouldn't assume one is male. But it has to happen only occasionally. Otherwise, natural selection is not going to favor it. All right. So we've talked about selflessness a little bit, but I wanted to talk about selflessness when it doesn't have to do with your own kin. The kin selection makes a lot of sense, okay? So kin selection makes sense because you share genes, and that makes sense for fitness. How does fitness push you to make a decision about saving someone? Why is blood relation so important to us, even as humans? Because kin selection is strongly selected for. this big deal scene, right? That we ended on last time. Reciprocal altruism is different, okay? So it's an exchange of fitness benefits and a quid pro quo separated in time. These are unrelated organisms. Reciprocal altruism is a way that organisms can choose and develop evolutionarily to cooperate as a group. That doesn't have to do with caring for their own families. Societal organisms in particular have this. So, do you guys recognize the quid pro quo comment? So, who has heard quid pro quo in the last year? And why did we hear that? Quid pro quo? We've been hearing about that for some reason. Why did we hear it? Anybody? There you go. We think of it as bribery, right? Or the president was impeached over this quid pro quo. I'm going to withhold your aid, Ukraine, until you give me what I want, which is dirt on my political rival. That was at least the reason he was impeached. But quid pro quo is often, not necessarily criminal, right? You often do this as well. So for this instance here, these are vervet monkeys. They're most likely to groom unrelated individuals. Remember, they groom their family members on a regular basis, okay? So like you're willing to hug your family members, or you're willing to, share clothes with them or do other things. They're most likely to groom unrelated individuals if they have groomed or helped them in the past, okay? So grooming is an important social behavior for these because they're giving each other basically health. They're grooming and taking out ticks and other bugs and dirt helps the monkey stay healthy, and they can't always do it very well on their own fur. So if this monkey has groomed the other monkey, it's more likely to get them. So helping others means that you'll be more likely to help them. And you can think of this as in a normal kind of way. Perhaps you've given multiple, small loans to your uncle, but he's never paid you back. But you have a friend who is in a trouble spot. They've given you help in the past. You're more likely to help that friend, unrelated person, if they've helped you, than a relative if they haven't been helping you. Because we operate on this kind of concept as well. And it's not just this specific person has to help you, but it's also about developing empathy. Empathy is a part of a evolved way of, we have evolved to have empathy for others and to put ourselves in their shoes. So reciprocal altruism is widely invoked as an explanation for the helpful and cooperative behavior observed among unrelated humans. This is a food bank. And these people who have less, who don't have the ability to get food, which is rampant right now in our society because of issues with COVID preventing people from getting jobs, from reducing the size of certain industries, in particular the restaurant industry. A lot of poorer people work there. Now these people, they may not know who the people are that they're serving, but perhaps they've been in their shoes. Perhaps they have been helped by a soup kitchen in the past. When I was growing up, I come from a very large family, and my dad was out of work for a bit. We relied on food banks, and we got several Thanksgiving meals donated to us by our church and by our food bank, our local food bank. And that was extremely helpful to having normal holidays. And every year, my husband and I, we take as much money as we can spare, and we give it to the Capital Area Food Bank because I remember what it was like to worry about not having a Christmas, to worry about not having Thanksgiving. And because of that, this is a form of reciprocal altruism in the sense that I have been helped by this group before, therefore I wish to help through that group. And so it's sort of a putting yourself in those other people's shoes. So there's a difference between cooperation, altruism, and mutualism. Okay, so we're going to talk about mutualism more when we get into community ecology that we're going to cover primarily next week. Okay, but some behaviors will appear altruistic, but they're actually selfish. So there's a little bit of difference here. Selfish means you are helping yourself when you help others. So let's say instead of giving to the Capital Area Food Bank because I am being altruistic, giving up my own resources because I have been in that place in the past and want to help people. If my actual reason for doing it is because it would look good when I run for political office, that suddenly becomes a little bit less altruistic and more it's directly helping me get more wealth. Or it's like when businesses, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this before, businesses latch onto a social movement. When all the businesses during Pride Week, they're like, here, we're going to change our logo to rainbow. And look, buy this rainbow thing. Technically, that's not altruism. Okay, they may give away a certain amount of that money to causes, but their goal largely in changing their logo and stuff, unless they're actually losing money on this, it's not altruism. It's a sort of mutualism, a cooperation with people and saying, if I give you this, then you'll give me this, right? And they're not actually giving up their funds. So one example in the animal world is that African dogs cannot hunt large prey alone. They're better served cooperating as a pack. So when they cooperate as a pack, it's not altruism. One of them's like, not like, oh, I'm going to give up my time to help you guys hunt. No. They're all benefiting from this directly. Without each other, they don't get as much food. Therefore, this is cooperation, and it's not altruism. Additionally, female horses that groom one another suffer less harassment from males and therefore have more offspring. Many of you likely understand the concept behind going to the bathroom as a group of girls in order to avoid harassment from males at, say, a bar. And this is a similar concept. You don't necessarily go because you're being altruistic, you're helping someone else. You're both helping each other. By being in a group is a safer thing to do than being alone sometimes, especially in an unfamiliar place. Again, we're going to talk a lot about this in community ecology. Something to know is that even though individuals will act altruistically, individuals in the animal kingdom do not act for the good of the species. Now, we are exceptions to this rule. We do sometimes act in a way that is good for the species. We may change our behavior because we see climate change happening, and even though we don't reap those immediate benefits in the future, we think that other people will. That's sort of a different piece. Again, partly because humans think about thinking and animals don't. Generally, though, individuals do not act for the good of the species. They behave altruistically when doing so increases their direct fitness, which reciprocal altruism, the concept here is that eventually if I act kind, then other people will act kind to me. That if I give into my community, they'll give back. Okay, so that's sort of increasing your direct fitness. Or inclusive fitness, I help my mother because she's part of my gene group, sort of concept here. Or when they're coerced. But helping others has costs and benefits that has to be weighed by the organism. And again, animals are not thinking about thinking. So they're not thinking what is best for the human race. They are thinking instead, what do I feel is best? And ultimately, certain behaviors are supported by evolution and certain behaviors aren't. Some behaviors didn't evolve in the same way, especially for societal organisms. We act in ways that are not always evolutionarily fit because of the way that we evolved as societal organisms and our conscious thinking about thinking. All right, that's all I have for behavioral ecology. Okay, so we're going to move on to population ecology. All right, here we go. All right, I have more silly comics for you guys. So we're going to be talking about speed of reproduction. Okay. Now this is a little bit unlikely. You can't actually create enough babies to pull yourself out of a pit. For one thing, you'd need a lot more resources in the pit, right? But it's a joke about how fast rabbits reproduce. If they reproduce fast enough, maybe they could get out of a pit. A little bit morbid. But we're going to talk about individuals and populations, distribution, which we've covered a little bit, survivorship, fecundity, and life history traits, and how that impacts the speed of reproduction. And we're going to talk about exponential, logistic growth, population cycles, which we've covered some in lab already, and also human populations. I hope to get to make it through human populations in order to help us understand, kind of directly relate patterns of fertility and fecundity and sort of the social pieces into how human populations change over time. All right. So, the number of individuals and populations change over space and time. We've been talking a lot about population level change in terms of evolution. So we need to understand now, how quickly do populations change? And how does that influence? So we talk about distribution and abundance, demography, which is basically the patterns of survival and reproduction and speed at which reproduction happens. Then we're going to talk about population growth and how that applies to population dynamics and human population and conservation of populations. All right, so population is the same species in the same time, same place, a breeding group, okay? Population ecology is how the group changes over time, the increases, decreases, etc., and how that's influenced by the environment. So this helps people who are trying in particular to conserve different populations or to understand how to control them better, understand how distribution and number change over time within a specific population. So here's a bunch of seagulls in one area. This is a bunch of people. And here's a bunch of bees. Obviously, all of these individuals will, they have a different pattern of distribution and the way that they congregate as a group. All right, first we're going to cover distribution and abundance, and then we're going to get into sort of understanding exactly why certain patterns of reproduction happen. So the range is a geographic distribution. We've talked a lot about history as a big part of that. Geographic distribution is affected by the history of the location, the biomes, how recently these two populations have met, sort of that Wallace line concept. And obviously it's affected by both abiotic and biotic. We've covered this extensively in ecology. Okay. One thing we're going to talk about also is the dynamic processes here, okay? Abiotic and biotic patterns change, and this means the population dynamics can also change over time. There's also different scales of where organisms live. For instance, here we have this big lizard, okay? It's called Zootoca vivipara, okay? It's like a fence lizard. Um, so they exist all over Europe and into Asia. And you can see, you look at this and you go, wow, they're everywhere. But when you're looking broad scale, it looks like, so you could also use this as a, maybe a certain people group. You could say, wow, these people live all over. But if you're looking at a broad range, this big map, okay, this is the global range. It's definitely different than looking at it at a regional or local range. If you look at it at a more regional range, well, you see that the population is very dense. So this is Europe. This is the UK area. Population is very dense in much of England area and Scotland, but it is sparse over here. Okay, so the patterns aren't as smooth as you see when you look at it from a global scale. If you look at it in a more local range, obviously now you see even fewer. We see these bunches, clumps. And the way that the clumps are working helps us to understand exactly. We have these groups of individuals. And this is not just a uniform setup, everyone is like 5 meters apart kind of concept here, okay? That maybe this is a patch of forest. Here's a city over here. Fewer in the city. We've already talked about how humans can influence where they live. Part of it is that there's patches of forest. So demography itself is talking about how different patches of populations will change over time using patterns of birth and death, and also movement of individuals, moving in, moving out of a certain area. All right, so I want a little bit more of interaction from you guys, okay? So we're gonna talk a little bit about starlings. Has anyone ever seen this bird outside their house? A large group of speckled blackbirds has landed on your lawn. You see these huge clouds of blackbirds squawking and flying over your house. They do not sound like crows, and they're about yay big. Has anyone ever seen that? Anybody here? Yes. And definitely, they started out as a population of 60 starlings. They were released in New York City. I don't know why they released them, but I don't think they had a good concept of how invasive species work. So, 60 European starlings, 1890. By 1920, the total population had reached 1 million individuals. Ooh, that was fast. 30 years later, 60 had turned into 1 million. That was pretty fast. So, in another 30 years, how many more? So we have from 1890 to 1920, 30 years. We went from 60 to 1 million. How many do you think are going to be there in 30 more years? 1950. What do you guys think? Give a guess. Is it going to be 2 million? 1 million change? 1 million change? Do you think it's going to be that, or do you think it's going to be different? Liliana thinks 3 million. Any other guesses? We're going to move forward. $500,000. Oh, so you think it's going to be smaller or 500 million, Candace? 500,000 is smaller. Oh, okay. Well, let's see what happens. 1950, hundreds of millions of starlings stretched across the U.S. Whoa. We moved from 60, 30 years later, 1 million, and suddenly, 1950, hundreds of millions. That's pretty big. Not quite a billion, but that's a lot of starlings. So now we need to ask, well, how? How did this happen so fast? So let's consider what would happen if we, let's take a model population of starlings and we're going to look at it, okay? So let's assume the original 60 birds contain 30 males and 30 females. Let's assume that all 30 females are in their prime nesting capabilities. Let's assume then that that each female is going to create 5 offspring, giving you 150 offspring. And you add that 150 to the original 60, you now have 210 birds. If still half of them are female and still each one is creating 5 offspring, you're going to have 525 offspring and 735 birds by 1892. If you keep going like this, if you actually followed this exact same pattern from 1890 to 1910, it would actually increase much faster than we saw. By 1910, instead of being 1 million, the starling population, if we followed this exact pattern and kept adding for every female, you get 5 offspring. You get 4 trillion in 30 years, not just 1 million. So what's happening here? What am I missing in my model? Why did my model say there was 4 trillion, but the actuality was there was 1 million? Why did the starlings not reproduce as fast as my model? What's missing here? Why did they only become 1 million instead of becoming 4 trillion in 30 years? What's missing in my model? Aha, yes. Starlings compete for food. They get eaten by predators. They are not immune to being eaten. Sure, they're generalists. They survive better than a lot of other songbirds do. But they also have competition for food. Something to note here is that in my calculation here, these 60 birds are part of 1895 population too. And in my calculation of 4 trillion, the original 60 birds are still around in 1910 and still having babies. Do you think that's true? The original 60 birds still having babies 30 years later? What am I missing in my model? Death. It's actually really important. I have the birth rate here. I don't have the death rate. Death rate is extremely important. Obviously, the death rate has to do with death from predators, death from starvation, and death from old age. That is all of the death rate. Starlings live on average about 8 to 10 years. And they're probably only going to create 5 eggs a year for about 5 years of that. So there's an age range that they can have a lot of babies. And so by this time, the original 60 birds, let's say they were at the peak of their sexual reproduction here. But by 1895, a lot of the original starlings would have stopped making babies or have been eaten. And since we're not including that, that's why I see 4 trillion as my model, because I haven't introduced a death rate. Death rates is very important, understanding what's limiting them. Because, and then also, another piece that I'm missing here. Even if males and females remained equal, which is what is in my model, what am I missing here in terms of how starlings have babies? What am I missing? One thing I'm missing here is obviously a little bit about the frequency of every female having eggs. Okay? So let's think about this. Let's say we have 30 25-year-olds and 30 25-year-old females and 30 25-year-old males travel across the Atlantic Ocean, find an empty space in say the Midwest. Would all 30 females have a baby by the next year? Do you think so? Even if they were in their prime of life? Candace, why not? They have 30 males to choose from. They have 30, they are fertile females. Why not? Why would that not happen for humans? Why would you think that those 30 females would not have 30 babies in 1 year? Imagine yourself as one of those 30 females. Why would you not have a baby in the next year? They may not like the males. Sometimes females just won't have the babies. Also, let's say you do like the males. You're married, you want to have babies. Why would maybe you not have them in a certain year? Tyler, you said no. Why would it be? There you go. It's a bad year, not enough resources. Resources will limit birth rate. Different females may have differential reproductive success. Also because of resources, maybe it's just a bad time. You're like, I'd really like to wait until our farm is started up before we have any babies. I want to make sure we can feed them, okay? And that's reasonable. I'd like to wait until I've finished training as a master woodworker. So I want to be able to provide for my children. That's another reason to delay. So this is another thing that I have wrong here in my starlings. I've assumed that every single female is going to be successful and that there's enough resources each year for every female to create 5 offspring. All right, so we talked about how could it be that fast? Well, this is exponential growth, and then why wasn't it? And we've talked a lot about the wasn't. All right, so the number of individuals present in the population depends on 4 processes. Populations grow as a result of birth and immigration, okay? Moving in populations and also having babies, okay? Populations shrink as a result of deaths and immigration. We are going to ignore for the moment immigration and emigration because they are a little bit more complex than the concepts here, okay? We want to just talk about, let's say we have an isolated population. No one's coming in. No one's leaving at the moment that we are looking at the population. We want to just understand birth and death rate now, okay? And in order to make population predictions, we have to figure out the number of individuals that are alive. And in each pattern, in each year, the number of survivors of each age group, offspring of females of different ages, how frequently do people who are 20 versus people who are 40 have babies? Obviously, the number of immigration and emigration, we're going to ignore that for now. But also the average time of mom's first baby to daughter's first baby. So that's the generation time. Generation times can vary depending on the organism. So let's assume no immigration or emigration because, again, those are complex pieces that have to do with population dynamics and resources in an area. We're going to talk about just growth rate of an isolated population. It's equal to the number of individuals in times the difference between the birth rate and the death rate. Okay, so this is the rate that the population is growing. How many individuals are being added each year? And the rate has to do with the number of individuals in particular, and then birth rate minus death rate. Okay, N times B minus D. The difference between the birth rate per individual and the death rate per individual okay, without the N, that's the per capita rate of increase. That's on average. For instance, there's usually about 2 babies per family on average in the United States. And so this is for couples kind of thing. At birth rate per female on average. Okay, some people have more, some people have less. But that's the and then we also can minus out the death rate from that, and then we have the per capita, per individual rate of increase. Okay, so because of death rate in the United States as well, we're at about replacement. So we're actually birth rate and death rate are almost the same, maybe except for now during the pandemic. All right, if the birth rate is greater than the death rate, R is positive and the population is growing. If the death rate exceeds the birth rate, R becomes negative. The population declines. So when B is greater than D, R is positive. And when B is less than D, R is negative. Okay? So in this population, it has a positive R, positive R, positive R. And then even if the birth rate doesn't change at this point, perhaps the death rate goes up. And now you have a negative R, negative R, negative R. Okay? A decrease in the population. When B equals D, R is 0. So if it flattened out here, then you'd have a R of 0. This is the R of 0 right here. So population growth equation, okay? You don't necessarily have to solve this because it is a calculus question. Who here is taking calculus? Raise your hand if you're taking calculus in the past. Anybody? Noor is taking calculus? Anybody else? It's okay if you haven't taken calculus. The concept with this is that you're finding the marginal rate of change, basically. And that's something that calculus does very well. So the key is that this is a derivative, okay? So you could also do dn over dt, okay? But it's just the change in n over the change in t. It's a derivative, and it indicates the rate. Rate is important, and you get rate from calculus. But the concept here is that this n refers to the change in the population number. And, the term change in t, that triangle is change, it refers to the change in time, okay? So the number that's changing over some increment of time is the rate times the number, okay? So you would read it as the change in population per change in time equals the rate of increase times the population size, okay? Reasonably simple to read there, but it makes sense, right? How fast the n is changing over time is going to equal the rate times the number. If R increases, a population grows more rapidly. And R of 1 means that in 5 generations, let's say like 8 generations, you've reached 1,000. But if your R is only 0.5, then to reach 1,000, it takes, to reach 1,500, which is what I'm pointing at, it takes about 13 generations, okay? So a slower rate of change means a slower growth. And we played with this sort of rate concept a little bit when we were talking about Hardy-Weinberg equations and the selection coefficient. All right, when conditions are optimal for a species, birth rates per individual are as high as possible. Death rates per individual are as low as possible. And this changes per species. Important to know this, okay? R for that species reaches a maximum value called the biotic potential, or rmax. So let's say in a year, what's the rmax for a human female? For humans, basically. What's the rmax in terms of birth rates for for humans in a specific year? How many babies can I make in 1 year, on average? 1. This has to do with my gestational rate, right? How long it takes me to carry a baby. Are there any animal species that would have a lower... so death rates per individual, reasonably low, actually. So if we're talking per individual, we have to talk about, there's half females, half males. So per individual is about 0.5. But then we have to think about death rates, which isn't that high, actually. So we probably, as a species, have an rmax of somewhere around 0.3 to 0.5, depending on the location. Okay, so is there any species that you think would have a lower biotic potential than we do? Their maximum growth is slower than we are. Who can think of an animal that has a lower rmax than we do? In the sense of birth rates and high birth rates, low death rates. Their highest birth rate and lowest death rate is lower than ours. Elephants. Who knows how long elephants take to have a baby? Actually, a little bit longer. Normally around 24 months. But elephants are weird. If it's a low resource year, if they have an embryo inside, they can arrest that embryo, hold it in stasis, and it can take them up to 4 years to have a child. Can you imagine being pregnant for 4 years? It'd be very unpleasant. All right. So the rmax itself is a function of species life history traits. What organism would have a higher rmax than us? There's a lot of organisms that would have a higher rmax than us, but think of an organism. Anyone besides Candace have an idea of an organism that is more rapid in their reproduction and perhaps have a lower death rate even in terms of per individual? Adeline, Angela, anyone have ideas that aren't just Candace? Come on, guys. Use your fingers. Or your voice. Anybody have an idea of something that would have a higher rmax than humans? Tyler, are you here? Do you have an idea? Saw you at your keyboard earlier. Type something in the chat. Angela? Nobody? Okay. Pigs. Okay, sure, pigs. And the reason pigs would have that is because they have maybe 10 babies at a time, right? And they can have 2 to 3 litters a year, so they can definitely have more children than we do at a faster rate. So obviously that rmax would be higher. Okay. rmax is a function of a species' life history traits, as I said. Some species naturally have many offspring and breed at a young age. Pigs, as an example, would breed at are able to breed starting at around a year old. Obviously humans, it takes a little longer. And elephants too. Takes until we're in our teens before we can actually have a child. This is a lot of pest species have many offspring and breed at a young age, like fruit flies, or as the joke in the beginning showed, rabbits. Sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Tickly nose. Okay. These have a high rmax. The R for their species is exceedingly high, mostly because they have so many offspring. And they start breeding almost immediately. Fruit flies, they live about a week. they can start breeding within 2 days of being born and have basically eggs every single day until they die. High rmax. Some species produce few offspring and take years to mature, like elephants and humans, okay? I use chimpanzees as an option because chimpanzees are a little bit less deciding when to have babies and more they have a society, and when they're ready to have babies, they will. But again, they mature in their teens, so do elephants. The rmax of a species does not change, though. This is something important to know, is that the rmax of a fruit fly never changes, but the R of a population does. Even if any one individual has that high rmax, as a population, usually R is lower than the rmax. But let's talk about what species traits are influencing this, okay? One main thing is birth rate, right? Fecundity describes the number of female offspring that can potentially be produced by each female in a population. So let's talk about fecundity. We're talking about across your entire lifespan. Technically, the fecundity of an average female, we probably have about 25 years or so of a baby a year. We could technically have 25 children. I would not recommend such things. Technically, that is our fecundity, okay? From about age 15 to about age 40. The average female can have one baby per year. That's completely different for obviously other individuals here, right? So let's talk about what species would have a high fecundity, okay? We're talking babies per lifespan. This is a turtle, a sea turtle. This is a lion. Which one has the higher fecundity? Talk about babies in their lifespan. How many babies, let's pretend this is the female instead of a male lion. Okay, how many babies can each individual have over their entire lifespan? Which one's going to have more and which one's going to have less? A guess? Anyone? Turtles? Lions? Turtle will have more. Okay, so Nora and Candace got it. The turtles have hundreds of eggs at once. Hundreds! How many babies does a lion have on average? Any ideas? Per litter they have, okay? They have more than one. They usually don't just have one baby. How many babies do they usually have? Hint, they're very similar to cats. Yeah. 3 to 6 is a normal litter size. Note that cats have 6 nipples, so I can't have too many more than that. I think I had a cat. My family had a lot of cats growing up, and we brought in a lot of strays. Sometimes the strays were already pregnant. So we had, so I remember once it was a mom with 8 babies, and it was pretty hard on her because there was only 6 nipples and they would fight. Poor kitty. We got her spayed after that. But yes, cats maybe 3 times a year can have a litter of 3 to 6 children. Turtles once a year can have hundreds. And so very different fecundity levels here, okay? Now let's talk about plants. This is a pine tree. This is a coconut palm. Which one has a higher fecundity? How many babies does a... Okay, so Candace and Tyler say pine tree, and it's true. pine trees have hundreds of pine cones. Each pine cone has something like 20 to 50 seeds. I don't know if you've ever seen a coconut palm in the wild. I know that a lot of people haven't. I have. I've seen naturally growing coconut trees in the Caribbean. And tops, they've got 10 at any one time. Okay? If each year this one's producing it and this lives to be like, 50 years old, well, obviously you have a lot of pine seeds. And this one's only creating about 10 per year. That's not a lot. Let's talk about why would anyone choose to only have a couple babies at a time? Well, that's the next piece. But fecundity is species dependent, okay? So house mice, they have between 3 and 14 babies 5 to 10 times a year. That's a lot. High fecundity. African elephant, remember I told you, they can have a baby every 2 years, but sometimes they will hold that baby inside for a long time, and it may take up to 4 years spacing between, okay? And so African elephants have the lowest fecundity here. But let's understand a little bit about why that is. Survivorship describes the proportion of individuals in a population that will survive to a specific age. Okay? So let's say that in terms of when we're talking about babies, what percentage of those babies will survive from 0 to 1 year old? We're just talking about surviving the first year of life. So which species, we're going to talk about the same ones, will have a high survivorship? Let's talk about which of these would likely have it over 80% of their children will survive to 1 year old. A turtle or a lion? Lions. Poor turtle babies. They get buried in the sand. Their mother abandons them. And then half of them barely even make it to the sea. They're eaten by lots of different organisms. Soft-shelled turtles, tasty. Birds and fish and lots of different things. Love eating baby turtles. They have soft shells. They're very meaty. Things will eat the eggs before they're born as well. So turtles, less than 10% of them make it to adulthood. More than 80% of lion babies will make it to adulthood. So we have a trade-off here, obviously. You can create a few babies, take good care of them, and get most of them to adulthood. Or you can have a ton of babies and spend your resources in quantity, and most of them will not make it to adulthood. Quality over quantity. What strategy do you choose? The pine tree and the coconut palm are similar. Has anyone ever eaten pine nuts? No, yes. Angela, have you ever had pesto? If you've had pesto, you probably had pine nuts. Okay, well, if you haven't had pesto, then you haven't had pine nuts. So pine nuts are, they're very common. I have had the unique opportunity to, I traveled to the Sierra Nevadas during pinyon pine season. And these pine trees, they're full of these pine cones. And you just take the pine cone, you shake it, and your hand is full of delicious pine nuts. I ate handfuls of them. They're so good. And pine nuts themselves, again, there's thousands of them every year. If I eat a handful of them, I'm not going to affect the population of pine trees because very few of them actually make it to adulthood. Very few will actually land and root and turn into a new pine tree. Very few. Has anyone ever tried to eat a coconut off the tree? I've had this unique opportunity as well. Candace, was it easy to eat that coconut? You picked it, you just started eating it right away. Was that easy? No. Some plants, instead of taking care of them like a lion would care for their baby, they care for them by investing more resources into each individual seed. Coconuts are well protected from predators. They are delicious, but humans have to use tools to get inside of them. So I lived in Belize for a few months, and I went on a long hike one time with a couple of local guides, me and a few friends, and we stopped in this clearing, and they went over to this coconut palm, and it had a ladder up the side of it. One of the guys climbed the ladder, picked coconuts enough for all of us, and then took a machete and chopped off the top. Best coconut water I've ever had, because I was really thirsty. But it took a lot of effort. He needed a very sharp machete to do that. It's very hard to get into them. At home, I don't own a machete, but I have bought coconuts from the store, and I use a drill to get into them. Without tools, it's actually pretty difficult. Some monkeys will throw them, but it's very difficult. So investing a lot in the offspring and making them big and strong means that most coconuts that are not eaten by humans with tools are going to make it to adulthood, or at least live long enough to find a spot to root. So there is this continuum. High fecundity generally means low survivorship. Low fecundity means high survivorship. And there are organisms that have moderate fecundity and moderate survivorship in their offspring. Something like birds, who take care of their young for a short period of time, but tend to be preyed upon even if they take care of their young. Okay, so there's some in the middle here. Not everything's on the extremes. But they're often inversely related. And you can understand why. Humans take care of our young, right? I could not take care of 1,000 babies in the same way that I could take care of one baby. I could not give enough resources to 1,000 babies to help them survive. I can give enough to one baby. And that's why our bodies are designed that way. Because we are social creatures who take care of our young. If we were not social creatures that took care of our young, if we had thousands of babies, well, then we wouldn't take care of them. Because we don't have the resources to do so. There's a limited number of resources. You can either use it to make tons of babies, or you can use it to take care of 1 or 2 babies. But taking care of tons of babies is not a possibility. There's not resources for that. So this is a trade-off, a fitness trade-off in terms of evolution. You can either maximize your offspring survival, or you can maximize production of offspring, fecundity. Resources are limited. Quality or quantity? Which one are you choosing? All right, at any one time, a species will have a specific R. As I mentioned, it's usually not rmax. Almost 100% of the time, it's lower than rmax. So what is limiting the rate of growth? Why do most organisms, most populations, have a lower R than rmax? Why is it not maxed out? What's lowering their rmax? What lowers birth rates? What increases death rates? That's going to decrease the R of a species. See, mice are often up here, but a mouse in the wild will be moderate to low, usually, or very low if it's a, say, drought area. What's causing them to have a not R max? What is creating that? Any ideas? Why would a mouse not constantly be maxed out? What would lower the R? Remember, lowering R means decreasing birth rate or increasing death rate. What would cause either of those to happen for, say, a mouse? Anybody have any ideas? So what would lower their birth rate? Tyler, what would lower the birth rate of a mouse? What would make it so they would have fewer babies than normal? Basically, maybe they only have 2 litters a year instead of having 5 to 10. What could cause that? Disease. Yes, that's a very good one. Maybe the mice are getting sick. Maybe sick mice can't carry babies. And therefore, disease can limit R. There's a lot of other things it can too. Anyone have any other ideas besides disease? Growth is usually density dependent. R declines with high birth rate. Because of the carrying capacity of the environment and resources matter. Remember we talked about the lynxes and the hares. When the lynxes were low, sometimes the hares would increase fast enough that they'd crash on their own because they were exceeding their carrying capacity. Okay? It's the number of species that can be sustained long-term in an environment. K can and does change over time. A forest fire, deforestation, a flood can all impact K. The availability of certain food can impact K. K for one species can be higher than K for another species. So it includes both the resources in an area, food, space, water, nutrients, temperature, abiotic and biotic resources. Where can you live? How much water do you need? How much food do you need? How much space do you need? And so it's kind of the concept of how much fundamental niche space is available to support a population. And it includes species interaction. Disease is one thing, but also predation. Something could be eating the mice, and that reduces the birth rate because, well, if half of your females were eaten, then you're going to have a lower birth rate and a higher death rate. Competition within the population themselves, competing for food, for mates, for space. What this means is we have to start changing the equation here. It's not just birth rate minus death rate equals R. We actually now have to think about how does the carrying capacity of the environment impact R. So, if the population of size n is below the carrying capacity, K, the population should continue to grow. The closer it is to the carrying capacity, the slower it will grow. So, that's called a logistic growth equation, okay? Rapid growth when n is small and k is large. So let's look. rmax, let's say the rmax for a certain species is 1, okay? Replacement level. And n, let's say, is only like 20 individuals. If the k is 1,000, you take 1,000 minus 20 over 1,000, and that's a pretty large number that you end up with, okay? Because you're not taking much away from this k. K over k is 1, which means it would be this number times 1 and nothing would change. But k, it's reduce this number a little bit, okay? So let's work this out real quick, okay? So we have change in the number, change t. We have to do this equation, okay? If a population equals 500 and k is 5,000 and r is 0.5, let's plug it in, okay? So I can write this out. So 0.5 times 500 times 5,000 minus 500 over 5,000. All right, let's do the second part first, okay? What's 500 minus 5,000 minus 500? Who can do? I can do it on mine too, but who wants to do that? 5,000 hold on. 5,000 minus 500. Okay, that's 4,500. Now divide it by 1,000. Sorry, divided by 5,000. Divide 5,000. It's 0.9. Okay. So if the rmax is 0.5, okay, and the n is 500, without k affecting it, okay, it means that you should be able to add in any one generation, in a generation like this, you should be able to add 250 offspring. Okay, I'm just going to type this out. There we go. So you should be able to add 250 offspring when R is maxed out. But if you're at 500 and the K is 5,000, you can only make 90% of that. So your the K equation is 250 times 0.9. That's basically, you're reducing it by 0.1. Okay, so it's only 90% of 250. It's kind of like when you turn in an assignment late here, and I grade you out of 90%. I grade you out of a lower score than I would normally grade you out of. Okay, and I've done this for a couple of you. So we have 250 divided by 250 times 9.9. Okay, that means that instead of 225. That would have been possible with the rmax. Sorry, 250 would have been possible with the rmax. You only have 225 possible. All right. Did everyone follow that? What I did there? So 4,500 divided by 5,000 is 0.9. Basically, you can only have 90% of the possible offspring now. It's reducing birth rate, it's increasing death rate to be in a certain K, okay? But let's say you're closer to 5,000, okay? 4,000 population times 0.5. Normally in a 4,000 population, you'd be able to create 2,000 offspring. See this? But if your maximum, your K is 5,000, 5,000 minus 4,000 over 5,000 is 0.2. You're only going to be able to create 20% of what you would have been able to create if the K was higher. If the K was infinite or something, okay? So that 0.2 means you're reducing it by 80% instead of just reducing it by 10% before. So now instead of having 200 offspring, you can only have 400. 2,000 offspring versus 400 is a big difference. And that's the influence of K. Who here did not follow what I just did? Who here has more questions about how to do the math? Everyone's okay? All right, I'm going to say silence is acceptance. We're moving on. Concept is the K slows growth as it reaches ecosystem capacity. So logistic population growth is the change in growth rate that occurs as a function of population size. Organisms are density dependent. They slow at K. So what happens is that early growth is rapid. As it begins to get to about half of that K level, growth begins to slow. It slows down and growth falls to 0. and they stay at that top level. Okay. And then we have these parameciums. Two different organisms have a different K. Okay. This paramecium, when grown alone, will grow from 0 to 100 pretty fast, but then it slows and stays at 100. That's its carrying capacity. Paramecium aurelia grows really rapidly over the first 5 generations, but then it slows down and it stops at about 450. That's its carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is different for each organism. Maybe a certain ecosystem can only support 50 elephants, but it can support 5,000 zebras. I don't know how many zebras are in a certain area. All right. Let's take a break. We just stuffed a lot of stuff in your head. I'm seeing a slowing of responses to me. Okay. Let's take a 10-minute break. Then we're going to come back and talk about the different species strategies, and we'll move on to talking about to finishing out density dependence and such, and eventually getting to human populations. All right, let's come back 10:33. Why are my clocks different? This one says 10:23. These two say 10:21. Let's say 10:33. You get a 12-minute break, okay? All right. Take a break. Come back. Get yourself a drink or something. And I will chat with you guys then, and we'll talk about the different species and how reproductive strategies and life history traits influence how K changes over time. Get to work. Oh. Okay. All right, I'm back. I'm back a couple minutes late, sorry. I was helping my daughter open a Kinder Egg, which, and then there was a toy to build, and I lost track of time. All right, is everyone back? Raise your hand if you're here. I can start up to a whole class. All right, Liana's here. 1, 2, 3, 4. We might be missing a few people, but, 5. Okay. Great. Okay. So, different species use different strategies to maximize reproductive success given the challenges they're presented. We already talked about this trade-off of reproduction versus, so we have fecundity versus survivorship, okay? So different species have a different sets of things. So species are referred to as R-selected if their rate of growth is rapid. Basically, if K is less of an issue for them, then basically their goal is numbers. Rapid rate of growth, R-selected. Species are referred to as K-selected if they slowly grow to the carrying capacity of the ecosystem and remain at that density for a long period of time. So this would be something like, say, elephants who slowly grow to the carrying capacity of their environment and will stay at a high density for a long period of time as long as there's no poachers. All right, so let's talk about R-selected species. Their motto is live fast, die young, make a ton of babies. Can anyone think of an R-selected species? Rapid maturity, short lifespan, tons and tons of babies. Spiders! Ugh. Yes, it's true. Spiders make thousands of babies. It's disgusting. But it's their life history strategy, right? So a lot of pest species are like this. Insects and mice and spiders and dandelions. Their goal is quantity over maybe quality. So this is a mouse. The mother does take care of her babies for a short period of time, but literally within about 2 weeks, those mice are ready to go live on their own. So they mature very quickly. And mice have a very high fecundity. That rapid maturity means that there's very little parental care, if any, okay? So there's a little bit of care from the mother here. That care ends in just a couple weeks. Short lifespan generally. Now, we did talk about turtles. Turtles are one of those weird exceptions. Once they've made it to adulthood, they are able to stay at adulthood, but very few make it to adulthood. The short lifespan is normal for most K-selected. A couple of them have exceptions, like the turtle would not have a short lifespan, but very few make it to the point at which they can last for 150 years. They have a very high rmax. One of the keys here is that they're usually poor competitors. Because they're doing quantity over quality. And generally, they are only able to live in areas where others aren't pushing them out. They have a high survivorship to the oldest age. The concept here is that once you get to a certain size, you're likely to live until your oldest age. Turtles are one example of this, is that as soon as they've reached basically sexual maturity, their shells are developed enough and they are large enough to basically not be able to be eaten very easily by most predators, and they can last another 100 years. Meanwhile, there's very low survivorship in the babies. Very few make it to the first few years of life. K-selected species. slow and steady wins the race. We've already talked about a couple of these. We would be case selected, usually. Elephants obviously are case selected. Redwoods themselves are case selected as well. They produce a lot of babies. Again, there's exceptions to the rule here, but they grow and they last for long periods of time. And they're very slow growing, but once they've reached their height, not very many even natural disasters can get rid of redwood forest. So this slow maturity and low fecundity rates, not producing a lot of offspring. And that slow maturity means that often, at least for animals, they are cared for by the parents, or for plants, there's a lot of effort that goes into each seed. Long lifespan. Okay? Redwoods can live hundreds of years. The elephant, humans, live over 100 years. A low rmax. There's not going to be a rapid rate of growth. But once they've made it to their capacity, they're good at staying at that capacity. They're not pushed out by competitors on a regular basis. They're very strong. Slow growth can equal strong. Low survivorship in oldest age. The concept here is that once an elephant gets to be about 80 years old, once humans get to be about 80 years old, well, they start dying reasonably quickly after that. That's when their survivorship plummets. But until then, likely most of the organisms are going to make it from babies to adults, to even 70-year-old adults, okay? Likely most of you think that you and your children and your children's children will make it to be at least 70, because barring any accidents, it is very likely that you will. And so in order to understand how this changes, we also can get these concepts of using all these demography, rmax, birth rates, rate of maturity, and plug them all into these survival tables. I'm not going to make you do the survival tables. This is sort of something we do in lab. It was not what I chose for the population size stuff that we're doing. But this is one way to understand it. Is so if you have Poa annua, you start out with 843 individuals. Then you're looking at the survivorship to 3 months old. Okay? 85% of them will survive to 3 months old. And that's when they start being fertile. They are the most fertile when they're 2. When they're 6 months old. And their survivorship to get to that very fertile stage is only 0.625. And so you can see that survivorship go down in the different age groups. By the time they've gotten here, very few of them have made it to the oldest age. You can do the same thing for the same lizard that we looked at before. These lizards have these age-specific fecundities. Obviously, they don't mature right away. Once they do mature, they peak out, but then they only live until 7, and very few of them will make it until the oldest age. So you can see that survivorship go down rapidly, and then a little slower, and then pretty rapidly after that, okay? Because they have a limited lifespan. So when we put all this together, this is the part I do want you to understand. You don't have to do the life history tables, but understanding these pieces is important, okay? You have type 1. These are your R-selected species. High survivorship from birth until old age. And then at old age is when the survivorship plummets pretty quickly. Type 3 is your R-selected species. We have K-selected species here, K. R-selected species here. Lots of babies, very low survivorship rate. Less than 1% will survive to the adulthood, past babyhood. And then high survivorship as you move forward. A high percentage of the ones that make it to this point will make it to the oldest age. different than the percentage of ones that make it this age that would make it to the oldest age. Okay. Low survivorship first, high survivorship after, high survivorship first, low survivorship after, and then you've got the middle one. Not everything fits directly into that exact K or R category. Type 2. This would be something like songbirds. Songbirds, their eggs and babies are indeed preyed upon. Additionally, songbirds, they take care of their young until their young is mature enough to go live on their own, which can be several months. But the birds themselves are also preyed upon. And so the chance of them living to this age is about the same chance as an adult living to 2 years later. The concept here being that different organisms have different life history strategies, and some of them, babies and adults both get preyed upon. Some, the babies get preyed upon, not as much the adults. Some, the adults get preyed upon or die, and not so much the children. So let's return briefly to our starlings. We talked about this huge increase. Starlings themselves had a very rapid rate of growth. It didn't appear that they were leveling off. It went from 60 to 1 million to several hundred million in just just 60 years. Very fast. Why didn't they slow down? Why did they speed up so rapidly? Why didn't K apply? Some things about K applied. Obviously, they had predators. They have a death rate. But they were sure reproducing faster than they would necessarily in, let's say, if you put 60 starlings in Europe where there's already a bunch of starlings, they would not reproduce that fast. Why didn't K apply when they were in the first 60 years of their existence while they were in the U.S., when they first came to the U.S.? Anybody? In the first 60 years, they came, from when they were introduced to when they blew up to several hundred million. Why did K not level them out? Why were they going up so fast? What was going on there? Anybody have any ideas? People are slow and tired today. Got a lot of work in my class, I understand this. All right, I'll move on, but I expect you guys to help me out later, okay? All right. The concept here is that the rate of growth was staying constant, and for one thing, they had a wide open space. No other generalist birds of that size existed in the U.S. at that point. And they basically had this open smorgasbord in front of them. Basically unlimited resources. They were as close to rmax as they could have been. So what happens when the rate of growth of a population stays constant and is not affected by the environment? You can see that if we start with a population of 100 individuals, and if you maintain the same rate of increase, even if it's very small, then you would rapidly get to a very high population. So again, even if it started at 0.2, no matter what you start at, 0.1, 0.5, eventually you'll get to an exponential growth rate, okay? Because if you do 100, then you get to 120. Remember, this is including any deaths, okay? So maybe it was 40 offspring, but then 20 adults died, okay? So a 20% increase, R equals 0.2. Is going to include both birth and death, Okay, 120 individuals. And then you have, from that, 142 individuals. Sorry, 144 individuals. And then from that, you get another, so it's like 180. If you keep going, in about 30 years, you're going to have this huge exponential growth because R is not going down. And when R is constant, you get what's called a J-shaped curve. It's density independent. It's not dependent on population size. Natural causes can cause this, okay? So plenty of resources. That's what happened when the starlings came over. There was lots of resources, and they were able to, as generalists, eat insects, eat seeds, eat a variety of different things. And they were very good competitors because they didn't have any of those co-evolved predators. So they were not recognized by many of the predatory animals. And they had a very high rmax. Plenty of resources can mean a J-shaped curve. Actually, starlings have leveled out now that they're ubiquitous across the United States. They have gone up, and then they leveled out. This can happen if there's a few individuals in a new habitat. Again, the starlings apply to this. A few survivors after a disaster will also go through a J-shaped growth. Because their numbers are so low and the K is so high, because all the other individuals are gone. And so this is what it can look like if there's a high R. Again, that low R will take a long time to get to that J shape. So the bottom of the J can be longer or shorter, depending. And so J versus S-shaped, and this has to do also with the way that different organisms survive, okay? So J over time, eventually something's going to happen here. This can't be persist forever. Now, either this one's going to go up like this, and then it's going to level out and become logistic, or what's going to happen if it doesn't level out? Is it just going to keep going up forever? What's going to happen? Come on, guys. Participation. You can do it. What's going to happen if they shoot right past that carrying capacity? What happens? What happened to the hares when they did that in the absence of... There we go. Candace has it. It's going to crash eventually. Exponential growth can never happen forever. At some point, you hit the limit. You find the level where resources no longer can give and your population crashes. The better thing for organisms is to hit the carrying capacity and stay steady. But for a lot of our selected species, their pattern is spike, crash, spike, crash, spike, crash, instead of ever leveling out. Growth is usually density dependent, and nothing can maintain exponential growth forever. So what factors can influence populations and why? Factors that influence the population, regardless of how big the population is, are considered density independent. So something that's going to affect the population, whether there's 200 or 20 individuals, is called a density independent event. Often these are environmental effects. So if a flood comes through a area that has mice in it, no matter what, 80% of the mice will be wiped away. And even if there's only 5 mice, 80% of them. If there's 200 mice, 80% of them. And that's how natural disasters work, sort of like the extinction events, okay? Natural disasters, change in the abiotic factor, a volcano, a fire, climate change, these are all things that are affecting them no matter how many individuals there are. They are affected in the same way at the same percentage rates of decline because it is not something that has to do with how big the population is. So factors that influence the population based on how big the population is considered density dependent. Okay? So if there's a low density of mice, then predation levels are low. If there's a high density of mice, then predation levels are high. And the reason why there's more hawks here is because there's more mice here. And we saw that in the lynxes as well. The reason why the lynx population went up and predation went up of the hares is because there were more hares. The more hares there are, the higher the predation rate. These are often based on biotic effects. Abiotic effects tend to be density independent, and biotic effects tend to be density dependent. Food shortages have to do with how many organisms are there who are trying to eat. Food shortages happen faster in large populations. Overcrowding, obviously, can only happen in a large population. Predation and disease. We've seen that as well in the pandemic. Disease rates tend to be more rapid they started out more rapid, at least, in the high density neighborhoods. Now they're starting to become more rapid in lower density rural areas. Density dependent effects after exponential growth can be dramatic. So this is what happened in 2004 in Africa. There was a very wet season. Northern Africa was extremely green, greener than it had been in a long time. The locusts that were there, locusts had tons to eat, and they laid more eggs than normal. More locusts hatched. And when they hatch, they change their behavior, and they swarm, and they eat everything in their path. So this is the what's called NDVI anomaly. Basically, more than normal amounts of vegetation, less than normal amounts of vegetation. The more than normal amounts is when they hatched, April 6th through 13th. That's when the baby locusts were just hatching. But look at in August to September. This is after they swarmed and flew south. The brown and the gray, that means that these areas have been completely deforested. Less vegetation than normal, caused by the huge amount of locusts. After the locusts had eaten everything, they died off in huge numbers too. They could not sustain that population. So it dramatically influenced the environment that they lived in as well. All right. Density-dependent factors tend to be based on biotic interactions. Intraspecific, interspecific. If it changes survivorship and fecundity, which are plugged into R, logistic population growth will occur. Carrying capacity is influenced mostly by density-dependent factors in the environment, mostly environmental interactions, interactions of food and water and space and such. Okay, so density-dependent factors generally define the carrying capacity for a certain organism. So here are those here. Okay, let's talk about today in the pandemic. The pandemic has made it obvious that certain factors are density dependent and some are density independent. So let's think about a small town back in April. This is important because we've learned to manage the virus better now, okay? I wrote this actually back in April when my students were just learning how to be virtual students. So, small town versus a major city. Let's think about which factors are changing with the density of the population versus which factors are not changing between the density of population, okay? So back in April, small towns versus major cities. If it changes between the small town and the major city, then it's a density dependent factor. If it does not change, then it is density independent. Okay, so let's look at this. This is where I expect you guys to participate. The virus infection rate. Think back to April. Was it highest in a big city or lowest in a big city? Where was the virus infection rate the lowest? Candace says it was highest in the big city. So, Candace and Angela, what city was it the worst in? New York City. New York City has one of the highest densities of population in the entire country. And in large part, the infection rate was really bad at first because we hadn't figured out how to manage the virus. And without that information about how to manage it, infection rates were off the charts. Infection rate now is somewhere around, infection percentage of population that's infected is about 3% there. It's about 8% here. That's the positivity rate. But the infection rate was higher in New York before they put in a lot of control factors, okay? Now let's think about availability of food and toilet paper in the stores, okay? If you were in the Midwest and you went to the grocery store back in April, or if you were in New York and you went to the grocery store in April, which one of you was more likely to find enough food and toilet paper for your household? Small town or a big town, a major city? In the Midwest, a small town. Now those small towns are having a big spike right now because, remember exponential growth, this is what happened. It started out slow because there wasn't very many to start. But because they haven't been putting in those control pieces, it's spiking now because very few defenses were put in even when that started to go up. Okay? But the food and toilet paper in the stores back in April was abundant for my sister who's in North Dakota. North Dakota is now the worst area, but even here in Maryland, I had trouble finding. I couldn't find tortillas in April. The tortilla manufacturers hadn't sped up their production. People bought all the bread off the aisles. It was pretty crazy. All right, let's think about temperature outside. Does it matter whether you're in does it matter whether you're in Des Moines, Iowa, or the cornfields of Iowa in terms of temperature? Does population density influence temperature? What do you think? Does population density influence temperature, yes or no? If you're near a big city, so let's say I'm in Bowie, which is a lower population density than DC, is it going to affect the temperature outside? The answer is not based on population, okay? Now, big cities have more impervious spaces, less trees. It does influence that a little bit to have a city there, but it doesn't matter if there's 200,000 people or 20,000 people or 2 people. It's the city itself. It's not actually the density of people. So the temperature outside is not impacted by density of people. What about, let's say you're in Kansas City, one of the biggest cities in Kansas, or you're in the boondocks of Kansas. Which one's more likely to have a tornado? Let's think about one spot. You're in a house outside the city. You're in a house in the city. Which one of you is more likely to encounter a tornado? Does it matter whether there's a high population density or a low population density in terms of whether or not a tornado will pop up? What do you guys think? No. Tornadoes are random. They occur based on weather patterns. Weather patterns are not influenced by population density, generally. They can be influenced by the presence of a city, but not how many people are in that city. Finally, availability of beds in the hospital. This was a complicated one, actually, because it depends on how many hospitals you have and the size of the hospitals. New York City's doing a million times better here because they have prepared more beds and have more hospitals. Midwest areas have less hospitals. But if you're talking about one hospital that's serving a dense population versus one hospital serving a less dense population, obviously the beds would fill up faster in a dense population, even if they have the same infection rate. Because more people in that infection area will be filling those beds because the beds are limited. All right. We're going to rush through population dynamics. I really want to get to human population because it is one of the more interesting pieces here, okay? Population dynamics are the changes in population through time, okay? Research on population dynamics has uncovered a wide array of patterns in natural population, not just exponential and logistic growth, but a bunch of different patterns that have to do with the environment itself. One of the keys here is metapopulations. So you have these habitat patches, okay? So maybe there's a suburb in between. And the butterflies can fly through the suburbs to get from one patch to another patch of, like, let's say, food. In this area, someone uses too much insecticide, kills off the butterflies. In this area, the butterflies, their preferred flower stops blooming and they go extinct. But the key here is that these populations aren't actually extinct. This species doesn't go extinct. Because there's nearby populated patches, these extinct patches are limited. Migration from one patch to another can repopulate relatively quickly, as long as the habitat patch is not destroyed. Once it's habitable again, it will repopulate. And this can happen over and over, and these metapopulations will continue to feed into each other. So in a patchy environment, it doesn't necessarily mean that the organisms aren't going to survive. It does mean that different parts will go extinct at different times, but they'll be repopulated each time. All right, we covered population cycles in lab 7, but this has to do with density-dependent factors. Okay, remember we talked about predation going up as the population of hares went up. But when the population of food goes down, either for the hares or for the lynxes, then populations crash. So predation, disease, food shortages, etc. intensify dramatically at high population density. It can cause a crash. And the hare and lynx have this pattern, okay? So hares go up fast, predation rates increase, and then the rabbits crash. Shortly after that, lynxes who can't find food crash as well. Because there's less lynxes, the rabbit population goes up, and et cetera, et cetera. We saw this pattern before. In terms of, we can use this as well to address conservation of species. Understanding the patterns by which organisms can survive helps you to figure out how to not disrupt populations via hunting, basically preventing us from overfishing. This is what a lot of the Fish and Wildlife group does, is it figures out, doing surveys of different populations, how many fishing licenses can be given out in a certain year for certain species, and how big of a species and how many species you're allowed to catch. Perhaps the eel, you're only allowed to catch 3 eel in a season for each person with a fishing license, and they can make sure that there is now enough eel of a certain size. Don't catch the babies, catch the big ones. Don't catch the really big ones. So you have a size range you have to catch. And understanding how these various ones are impacted by human intervention can help control and conserve these, assess these. So, for instance, the smallmouth bass itself You can catch ones up to 20 inches long, but not bigger, and you can't catch ones that are less than 8 inches long. This means you're only catching the healthy individuals in a certain age range, and you're preserving the younger ones, and you're preserving the older ones. And this allows for them to have a good set of population, and they only give out a certain number of fishing licenses, and they say that you have a limit of how many you can catch. And you will get a major fine if you're catching these outside of the season or without a license, because this is how we help conserve species. All right, I'm not going to go through this. Human population is the one I wanted to jump into in our last half hour of class, okay? So, agricultural revolution happened here. Humans moved from small roving bands of population in 10,000 years ago to being more stationary, forming cities, agricultural areas around the cities, okay? Building the great pyramids of Giza and such, okay? It took nearly 10,000 years from here to hit 1 billion. How many years afterwards did it take us to hit 2 billion? You can look here. 10,000 years to get from less than just a couple million to 1 billion. How long from 1 billion to 2 billion? You can look at the pattern here, right? How long from here to here? You can guess based on the time frame. How long do you think that was? How many years? Who knows the population of the world right now? What is our population today? Actually, we're about 7.5 billion. Back when I was in high school, we were 6.5 billion. Hasn't been that many years. So we obviously jumped up a billion pretty fast since when I've been alive. It only took 123 years to reach 2 billion. And then 33 years to hit 3 billion. And then, I'm going to tell you from my experience, about 12 years to go from 6 to 7 billion. We're definitely decreasing that time frame. What changed? What here is different that's now allowing human populations to grow at increasingly faster rates? What changed? Something changed. The movement from this steadiness. Aha! Candace has an idea. Medical care. Definitely. Right around the Industrial Revolution was right when we started to figure out vaccines. And when we started to figure out maybe wash your hands. Here are these new drugs. Medical technology has gotten much better. Medical care. Medical care means survivorship goes up. It doesn't necessarily mean that birth rates go down. So that equals growth, right? What else changed? What else changed? Does anyone know what this contraption is? It's cotton gin. Makes us able to be able to separate cotton and harvest cotton at a very fast rate, faster than humans would normally be able to do that on their own. So what happened to help us support a higher population on Earth? Right near the agricultural revolution was right near the industrial revolution was also an agricultural revolution, right? So what does that mean? We were now using, 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 we were now using machines to harvest and plant crops. How does that help us survive as a species? Come on, guys. This is the interaction part here. More food. Yes, we're able to produce food at higher rates and support more individuals. All right. So we've decreased death rate. We now have resources to support a higher population. And birth rates have not gone down that much. We're in an exponential growth rate. What do you think the population maximum is that the planet can support for humans? We're at 7.5 billion right now. What's the maximum number of humans that the population can, that the Earth can support? Because it's not infinite. Who has a guess? Anybody? Noor, Tyler, Angela, anyone else who's been participating? Who can guess how many people can live on Earth before the Earth can't support us anymore? Before there would have to be a crash of human population. Candace thinks 10. Anyone else have a suggestion? Throw out a number. Hopefully it's higher than 7.5. Any ideas? Liliana thinks 12. You guys actually are right on the right track here. It is 10 to 12 that they think is the maximum level of a human population. Next question is, how fast do you think we're going to get there? When will we make it to 10 billion based on our current rates of reproduction and medical care and such? When are we going to get to 10 billion? How many years from now? Angela thinks 30 years. You're actually really correct. They estimate somewhere around 2050. You guys will all be alive in 30 years, so something to be aware of. We're growing really fast. We're talking about 2.5 billion more people in 30 years. It's a lot more. And so trying to understand then, what are the consequences for the human race? Right now, what kind of growth curve are we following? Exponential or logistic? See, this is an old one. This is about 10 years old. 6.5 billion. We've gone up a billion since then. We're following an exponential curve. What happens if we keep following it? Is this good news for the human race? Not really. A crash obviously will follow. Okay. So we already talked about that. So the future here, this is a good question. Likely we're not at this low rate here, okay? This was done back in 2010. Since we're already at 7.5 billion, I don't think we're going to stop by 8. Question is whether or not we're going to start leveling out. If we don't stop leveling out, we can start shooting past our K. Once we shoot past our K, it's hard to come back. So trying to make sure, A, that we improve the K of the Earth, by taking care of the Earth, but also, how do we reduce the birth rates? That's a good question. How do we reduce birth rates across the world? We want to get to basically only replacement, not a shrinking population necessarily, but a stable population. So let's talk about first, where do the majority of people live now, okay? If the United States is number 3 in the world for number of people, where do the majority of people live? Who knows the countries? Don't name a region. We want countries. Actual countries. China. That's a very good guess, Liliana. China is number 1. India. Okay, so you guys know where people live now, right? So let's look. China and India. Okay, this is almost 1.4 billion, 1.3 billion. We have 300. We actually are up near about 360 million people now. This is a little older, just 3 years ago. Indonesia. So let's look at the rest of the ones in the top 10. Indonesia, Brazil, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Russia, and Mexico. Let's look at where all these are in the world, right? Indonesia. Indonesia is over near India, actually, in the ocean there, okay? South of Thailand and area. Sorry. Sneezes. Brazil. That's in South America. Okay? Pakistan, Middle East. Nigeria, Africa. Bangladesh, also near India. Russia. Okay, Russia's a very large country, and it's in Europe and Asia. And Mexico. So we have different ones spread over all the areas, okay? Asia is obviously a very rapid growing, but it's also a very large continent. Human populations are obviously not evenly distributed, okay? We don't have a lot of people in the Sahara, no surprise, or near the North Pole, not a surprise. So there's density in various places, okay? Very dense China, India, Indonesia, somewhere around here is Bangladesh. So we have these patterns here, okay? Where is the majority of people going to live in 2050? Is that going to change? Are we just going to see those numbers go higher, but the ranking will stay the same? Or will the ranking change? What do you guys think? Do you think we're going to see any new countries? And if so, where do you think we're going to see those countries from? Because really the question I'm asking is which country has the highest R, high birth rate, and increasingly lower death rate? What country or group of countries is going to have the highest R and maybe start beating the US in 2050? What do you guys think? Where will the majority of people live in 2050? Based on the locations that I pointed out, all those places. Okay, so let's go back real quick. We have, majority of them are living in this area right now. Okay? A little bit in this area, obviously all over this area. This area. Okay? There's some Middle East countries here that are also very populous. What country is going to start to beat us out? Will it be the country you expect? What do you guys think? Where is growth rate the highest? What region of the world? You can say more regional than local. Do you think the top 10 countries are going to change in 2050, in 2100? Well, what will they change to? Who has an idea? Anybody have any ideas? What? I know, I've lost you. Oh no. I'm not connected. Hold on. Okay. I'm back. Okay. You guys didn't hear me again? Suddenly my internet went out and it came back. I'm okay now. Alright. India, South America, Australia. We think these are going to be the highest rates. Well, let's look. So this is 2100. It's going to be very similar in 2050. Let's look at what's changed. India is now beating up China. China is number 2 now. Oh, wait. What's number 3? Nigeria. Nigeria was on the top 10, but it was a few down from the United States. United States is number 4. Let's look at familiar ones. Pakistan and Indonesia are still there. Hold up. We've lost some. Brazil's not there anymore. And we've lost Russia. Instead, we've been replaced by Congo, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Uganda. What do all the new ones on here have in common? Where are they? What do we have in common? They're all in Africa. I wonder why. Let's go look. So this is showing the 2100 patterns here, okay? These are 1,000 years apart, okay? 1800, most people lived in Europe and China. Then 2000, this grew, and now, 2100, what happened here? Africa's been low in population, and then suddenly explodes. Let's look at the fertility rates and how they've changed over time. 1950 to 1955. Baby boom. Okay? This is after World War II. The U.S., on average, people are having 4 to 5 babies per woman. That's a lot. But look at Africa. In the Middle East, some of them are 6 to 8 babies per woman. Something to note is also that infant mortality is also high. China, before they introduced their first, their one-child policy, they were up near 6 babies a woman. Okay, obviously not great here. Indonesia, a little bit darker in India, but lots more people. Okay, let's look now at 2010 to 2015. Per woman in the United States, we're down at about 2 per woman. We've dropped. We don't have that same level. And some places actually have less than replacement, okay? So that's under 1.4. Some of these are actually shrinking now. But wait a second. Africa itself, some places still have over 6 babies per woman. And guess what? They're the places that we saw climbing super fast in those top 10 lists. There's a reason for this. Look at the number of babies per woman, 2010 to 2015. This is the birth rates, okay? So we have above 5. 1 to 2 is most of this area. Below 1 is in some of these shrinking locations, okay? Japan, lots of European countries. Now let's compare this to GDP per capita. You guys notice anything? Where are the highest birth rates? Are they in rich countries or poor countries? Green is low GDP. Red is high birth rate. Poor. The poorest nations are the ones increasing the fastest. This is not good. Poorer nations have less capability to support women who are having babies, less education. So how do we influence these birth rates in order to not have these population explosions? How do we help reduce the birth rate in places that cannot sustain this high population? It's basically going to turn into slums, which it has in Nigeria already, has in India already, which have poor populations. The hint here is that fertility rate versus GDP per capita here, okay? So we see highest rates at very low GDP per capita. And when you get over to about US level, okay, we've dropped down to between 1 and 2, okay? I want to point out the outlier because this is important to what's happening. Saudi Arabia is a reasonably rich country in terms of GDP per capita. Most others are between 1 and 2. It's up at 4. Does anyone have any guesses for why Saudi Arabia is an outlier in this? They're rich, but why are women having lots of babies? Religion is one piece. Not just religion, though. How are the women who are having babies treated in Saudi Arabia? Do they have the same opportunity as men? Are Saudi Arabian women treated as equals there? They don't work. They're not treated as equals. They are treated as they don't have opportunities. And this tells a large story because actually, so birth rates are highly correlated with relative wealth of a nation. And this usually has differences at age at which women bear children, but also has to do with treatment of women. So we're going to talk about both of those, okay? Women in poorer countries typically have children at a younger age than do women in wealthier nations. So, and you may have experienced this in a small microcosm in the U.S. In poorer areas of the U.S., teen pregnancy is at an all-time high. This is partly due to education and partly due to religion as well. People preventing people from learning about sex practices, okay? But in poor areas, people start having babies early and continue to have babies later. Wealthy nations, it peaks between 25 and 34, and then is very low teen pregnancy and very low older women pregnancy. So this is the potential fertility of a woman from about 15 years old to about 50 years. You can have a baby every single month, but the choice in the matter and reasons to have choices matter. If a woman is delaying childbirth to focus on education and career, she will delay her first child until later. I had my first baby at 31. The ability to space birth with contraception. So I'm going to tell you guys something that I haven't told many of my classes, is that I have actually chosen to space birth with contraception, and here's me at 35. And actually, I am expecting a baby next semester. But I have that capability. Thanks. I've been sitting down this whole time. You guys haven't even seen me. But here's the deal. I have that luxury. I was able to use contraception, and actually, I was able to choose more. I had to use some infertility treatments. And I was able to choose, though, when I had my babies, spacing them out 4 years apart. Not every person has that choice, has access to the ability to choose when they have their child. I'm also going to have my tubes removed when I have this baby to end my reproductive potential. Not every person has access to that kind of medical thing. I have privilege because I am rich. I have privilege partly because I'm white. And that ability to do these things has allowed me to space out my pregnancies to where I wish it to be. If women have opportunity outside the home and are able to hold a job, I was able to get education and get a good job that I wanted. Sex education, access to contraceptives, incentive to get education. Basically, I got educated because I knew that there was jobs out there. If you're told that women should not get educated, if you're told that women are not supposed to have a job outside the home, then women will have more babies. Fertility goes down if women have these things. So you can actually see that in countries that have more percent of girls enrolled in high school, just graduating high school, the fertility rate goes way down because people are able to make choices about having children. So you see this, again, this is completed years of schooling for women of reproductive age. The more schooling you've done, to a point, reduces your fertility rate. I'm going to be right in the average. I'm going to have 2 babies, okay, total, in my entire fertile life. And I've had about this many years of schooling. A lot of years of schooling. And this even applies to poorer ones, even with the culture of having more babies. Okay? Ethiopia, in uneducated women, the birth rate is 6. Even in countries where women are not encouraged to get education, if they do, the birth rate drops. Providing opportunities and education for women reduces birth rate because they are able to do something besides be homemakers. This will reduce overall population and reduce the impact of overpopulation in poorer areas that do not have the infrastructure to support high populations. And what's happening is that in areas that are having lots of babies and high survivorship because we have so much medical technology, by 2050 they're going to have so many people. Meanwhile, in a developed country that has had healthcare and such for a long time, they're not growing at all. Have a few more older people, but not many more babies in 2050. And some of these age groups will actually even decrease. They're going to stay steady. Honduras is exploding. So we're going to look at a little bit of how the patterns have changed in across different time periods. We looked at 1950 and we looked at 2010. This is going to be your class activity, so I want everyone to pay attention for just a few more minutes, and that class activity will pop up. I think I originally had it due on Tuesday. You have a lot due this week. I'm going to make it due the Monday after you come back from break, and I'm going to remind you guys to do it, okay? This will give you some time to actually work through it. So, let's look at the United States for a moment. And I'm going to show you where to find these graphs, and you can check them out yourself for different countries. We're going to look at the United States for a moment. All right, babies per woman, way back in 1800, okay? People were having a lot of babies. Not many people were surviving. You'd have 7 babies, and maybe 4 of them would survive to adulthood. As we went along, okay, so we start plummeting partly because better medical technology, better opportunities for women voting, okay, some drop there, and then suddenly it stays low for a little while and it jumps back up. What's happening here? Why did we have a low birth rate between 1930 and 1940, and then suddenly it jumped? What happened? Why did the baby boom happen? Who knows why the baby boom happened? World War II. This was the time when the men in our country were going to war. And this is when we were prosperous. But right around 1960, things started to plummet again. You want to know why the baby boom ended? A piece of why, at least. What was happening for women around 1960 to 1970? Why did we reduce that birth rate then? Very prosperous at that time. The women's liberation movement. Access to contraception. Roe versus Wade. Ability of women to start choosing what happens to their body. And then it dipped here and then it went to where we are about now, right about replacement. Okay? Now let's look at survivorship rates. Life expectancy in years, okay? It was 40 for a while, okay? We weren't really old. Wait, here's a dip. What's happening here? Anyone know what happened in 1865 in the United States? Why do we have this plummet? What happened in the United States in 1865? Why would our birth rate go down? For those of you who don't know, okay, yes, Candace has it. She remembers her history. Civil War happened. Civil War was extremely deadly, okay? We killed a lot of people in Civil War. This is World War I. But check out World War II. We had very little dip there. World War II did not happen on our soil, and we had better medical technology to save those who were part of it. It's different if we look at places where the war was on their soil. This is Germany. Germany didn't have a civil war back then, so they don't have a dip here. They've got a dip, though, in for the Great World War, World War One, and a huge dip right about D-Day when the United States and other countries beat Germany. There was a huge dip in life expectancy. All right, we're going to go here real quick. You guys are going to be doing this and checking out a country that's not the United States. Choose a country that you're connected to in some way. You find your heritage in that country. You are busy with, so you are interested in the history of that country. You have a friend or relative who's close to you who has heritage in that country, okay? So let's go here, okay? And I'm going to show you how to do it. All right, we're going to, so this is the tool. All right, you're going to see bubbles when you go to it first. You want to switch over to trends, okay? All right, I'm going to make this full screen so you can see. Okay, this shows you which countries you have here. So I don't want the United States. Let's look at, let's say Nigeria, okay? Just Nigeria, we're going to apply that, okay? This is income per person. I don't want that. I actually want to look at, so click this, babies per woman. So we've gone over here, there was a little bit of a jump, and then it's gone down since, okay? So let's figure out what's happening here. Let's look at life expectancy. All right, 1920, actually 1918, 1917, it actually wasn't a country yet. So this is going to reflect actually British occupation of Nigeria. Okay, so this, they were affected by the World War II. 1969, there was a huge dip. In one of my other classes, we don't have time to go through this right now, but one of my other classes, we looked that up. There was a civil war in Nigeria. And that civil war, after it was done, Nigeria became independent. And that's why the life expectancy has gone up, partly. And if you look right about at that same time, when's the baby bump? Starts here, goes to here. That's because of the end of the war. They have a baby boom, similar to how we had a baby boom. Okay? So something to consider here. All right? So you're going to choose one of these. You're going to look at those two, and you can also look at general population. Is it increasing or decreasing? Nigeria is obviously increasing. If you look at, let's look at Japan. Where's Japan? You can look at Japan versus, okay? Japan has leveled out and actually has started to go down a bit, okay? And started out here and then leveled. Japan has been actually steady or decreasing for a little while. Okay. All right. So I'm going to close this. This is your activity. You're going to choose a country, any country you'd like to choose on there. You want to look at the trends. You want to look at babies per woman, which represents fertility, and life expectancy, which represents death rate. Total population size, and we're going to find events. You're going to look at what caused life expectancy dip here, what caused the increase in babies per woman here, and relate them to social events. And then report on that, and then talk about how overall there's increase or decrease, okay? So you're asking these questions. Why did fertility suddenly rise or fall? Why did death rate rise or fall? China is fascinating. Japan is fascinating. India is fascinating. Events that don't happen anywhere else. Okay, so I strongly encourage you guys to check out ones that either you're connected to or you have some great interest in. That's all the time we have. Okay? Please come to lab today. We can talk through any of the rough lab report you're struggling with. It is due today. I moved it to today because I want you guys to have one more chance to talk to me about anything you're struggling with. If you don't finish every section, it's okay. I'm going to give you feedback no matter what. It's just how much time you have to spend on it to fix the feedback. Secondly, lab quiz 4 is due today. If you don't do it, you're going to get a 0 on it. Try to take it. It's on labs 10 through 12. 12 is due today, okay? We talked about 12 last week. 13 is available now. It's not that complicated of one, but make sure you understand how to build a food chain, okay? And so make sure that you are able to do all those things, okay? The rough draft, no matter how rough it is, send it to me by midnight tonight, okay? I will give you as much feedback as I can. If you're missing a whole section, it's okay. You have 2 more weeks to finish it. But I want you guys to be finishing it, okay? Give me something today. Make sure you spend some time on taking your quiz and come to class to ask about any of these pieces. What do I study for 10, 11, and 12? How do I build my discussion section? What's supposed to go in? How do I make a graph? Any of these pieces are going to be available to you. And I did post our discussion from last week under the how to organize and create graphs in your data, how to analyze your data. Okay. Does anyone have any questions right now before we end class? I am all done for now with that. Let's turn this off. That is due next Monday, the activity, okay? And so, sorry, not next Monday, the Monday after that. I'll remind you about it, but you can do it by this Monday if you'd like to get it over with, okay? Any questions before 12:30 when we start our lab period? Again, you may come in time between 12:30 and 2:30. I will be available to talk. If you come at 2:30, I can talk until 2:45, so I have time. Okay. All right. If I don't see you during that time, have a happy Thanksgiving. We do not have class next week. We have one more class session after this. One more. And that's going to be when you have your lab exam too. So just make sure you're aware that we do have a lot due in the next few weeks. Enjoy time with small families, not gigantic. And do take a little bit of time off. I will give you feedback on your lab reports by Tuesday, so you'll have a full week and a half to fix it. Okay? All right. I'll see you guys later, either later today or after Thanksgiving. All right. Talk to you soon.